Welcome to the Awaken Your Kundalini Summit, where leading Kundalini teachers and practitioners are sharing wisdom and practices to shift your frequency and create a more connected relationship with yourself. Share this event with your friends and family, and join us on Facebook at The Shift Network. And now your host, Kia Miller.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so delighted to introduce our next guest, Kara-Leah. She's from Down Under in New Zealand. She's an internationally renowned retreat leader, teacher, and author. She's passionate about liberation in this lifetime, and Kara-Leah practices and teaches an everyday path to awakening. And she's here to talk to us today about life after awakening, unpacking the subconscious. So welcome, Kara-Leah. We're so happy that you're here with us.
Thank you, Kia. It's a delight to be here with you.
And I would love to start just with your story of awakening, if you would be so kind to share.
Yeah, absolutely. Where to start? So I've always questioned the nature of reality, truth, conditioning, society. Even as a young girl and a teenager, I was always one questioning my teacher in class about everything. And when I was in my 20s, I went overseas, I went traveling, I kind of went a bit wild. I was partying a whole lot, I was exploring. And that exploration included recreational drug use of all kinds, dancing a lot, going to full moon parties, going to a lot of raves. And I started getting into yoga and meditation. By the time I was 29, that combination of factors added in with a really challenging emotional relationship basically created this perfect storm where I had a extraordinary experience of unity consciousness of just all of a sudden I was everything, or everything was me, or there was no sense of personal identity. There was a sense of knowing just all of these things, like everything was just clear and obvious. But I wasn't grounded, I wasn't centered, I still had so many samskaras, so much conditioning, so much going on emotionally. And that combination of things basically sent me all the way to psychosis and completely blew my circuits. And I ended up in Lionsgate Hospital in the acute psych ward there in August of 2004. And then again, a month later, my fiance broke up with me. And the grief of that and my inability to be with the grief led to disassociation, which of course, because I was already in a fragile, vulnerable state, sent me back into psychosis. So I came out of that experience realizing that what had happened to me wasn't just psychosis. It wasn't, from a Western medical model, they looked at me and they went, oh, you're bipolar, you're mentally ill. And I was like, nah, there's something else going on. I had some other experience. So I really began to research, to study, and to practice yoga with, I let the drugs go at that point. It's like, right, I really need to stabilize myself and get grounded. And so that was a huge turning point. There's always going to be life pre-psychosis and then life post-psychosis. So that was when my focus on liberation in this lifetime really amped up, because I went from being in this extraordinary bliss state, knowing it all, to being right back in conditioned mind and in the deepest level of suffering. And it was so freaking painful. It was like the only way out was to dissolve the suffering, to release the bonds of conditioned mind. So that's what I've been doing for the last 15 years.
Wow, that's an extraordinary story. Just the image of the experience of infinity back down into the limitations of the conditioned mind. That does sound like the most painful thing possible. So that's yeah. Wow, that's all I can say to that. So what has been your process since then of, as you say, unpacking the unconscious? Like what is it that you needed to do?
Mm-hmm. So the first thing that I did was I had to come back to New Zealand. I couldn't stay in Canada, and that was really hard. I left my whole community behind. And I loved Canada. I was in Whistler, I just absolutely loved it. So there's a lot of grief in coming back, and I didn't want to be there. So there was massive levels of resistance. I had all of these ideas and feelings about being a total failure. And so that was making it worse. But I didn't have enough awareness at that time to recognize that my own resistance and the filters that I was putting over top of my experience were adding to my suffering. What I did know was that I needed to practice every day. And I needed to get into my body because I was right back in my mind. So I began to walk in nature or run in nature every day. And I got on my yoga mat every day, and it was painful and it was hard. And so often I'd hit a posture and I just start crying, and I cried and I cried and I cried. But over time, that process of practicing every day, showing up, allowing myself to feel what was there, began to dissolve things. And it took a long time, but by doing that, I was also able to observe myself in action and start to realize that, when I've got really strong resistance to getting on the mat, that's when I often have the biggest emotional breakthrough. So that was a real shift as well, because when a resistance would come up, mat resistance, I would know what was on the other side. So I'd get excited. I'd be like, yeah, strong resistance, it's going to be a big breakthrough. Let's go. So my process was like following the breadcrumb trail, because I didn't have any particular teacher I was working with. I didn't really have a lot of context. I was, walking blind, trying to figure out and just going with what I know right now. I need to get on the mat. I need to feel my feelings. I need to trust this process. I need to show up every day. And that stood me in really good stead.
Wow, that's amazing. And just, having this experience and not having a teacher, that's takes a lot of tenacity and will to kind of to forge forward. But then, as you say, having enough of your own direct experience that it's fueling you to face the resistance and get onto the mat. That's incredible right there. And so when you describe the awakening, it is what you're saying, that it was the impact of that experience that kind of echoed in your consciousness that kept you going? Or did you literally feel different afterwards, sort of even, within the psychosis, you could say?
Yeah, I think both of those things were true. Like even when I was in the psychosis, like there's, quite a few clear memories. Like there was a part of me witnessing, there was awareness of what was going on, but I couldn't stop what was going on at the same time. And I couldn't really reach out and connect with the people around me and communicate what I was experiencing internally. And so afterward, my sense of what made the process possible for me was, one, I'd had this real experiential, embodied experience of unity consciousness. Like I just knew how life could be. And there was a part of me that was like, I'm getting back there. I'm going to experience that again. I'm going to do whatever it takes. And I also had a real clear sense of like, I was no longer identified with my mind, identified with the stories, identified with the contents of consciousness as such. And that was a knowingness that was inside of me because of the experience I had. Now, I still had to do the hard work because I was identified, but I knew that the thing was to disidentify. So every time I would become aware of or recognize or see something, then I could attend to it. So it was this like being shown the end of the road as such, and then being dropped back at the very beginning and going, now find your way there. And it was a really rebellious part of me. Like I remember being in the psych ward and just going, the sun will shine in my life again. I'm gonna suss this out, And so like the rebel heart warrior was strong, and that's definitely made it possible for me to do what I've done in the last 10, 15 years.
Amazing. It's so interesting. You just reminding me there, one of my teachers, and I also share the background of the rave scene. So I really get that, those experiences that could be had with the dancing and the psychedelics and everything. But I remember one of my teachers saying to me, that the psychedelic experience, it's like the trailer to the movie. It's like you get the glimpse, but you don't get the whole thing. And so here we are, we're both devoted students of yoga, and we know that yoga can deliver us the whole thing, that step-by-step process, that gradual unfolding. And what you're describing with the process of kind of unpacking all of the thoughts, I feel like to me, that's the real work of the yoga, is right there, that disidentification with all of the ways that we are identified, and awakening to the deeper reality. So yeah, please share a little more on that, of what you've discovered along the way.
Mm-hmm. One thing that was really useful for me along my journey was in 2006, I went to a weekend workshop with a teacher called Swami Shantimurti, who has passed now. He's a man in New Zealand, New Zealander. And he was speaking about Kundalinī Awakening. And as he was describing it, I was like a recognition. And I went up to him afterwards and was like, could that lead all the way to psychosis? And he kind of looked at me, and there was just a knowingness, and I just felt seen. And he ended up saying to me, you've had that experience, haven't you? And I'm like, yeah. And he spent time with me. He let me come around the next day for coffee and just listened to me as I kind of unloaded for the first time everything that I'd experienced. And he said this one thing to me. I mean, he gave me a couple of practices, but he said, you're bound by fear. You're so fear-ridden right now. And when he said that, it was like another one of those breadcrumbs. And I recognized that the road to liberation, to slowly unwinding, dissolving the conditioning, meant that I had to identify whenever I was being bound up by fear and turn toward it. And that, as a navigation tool on the road of liberation, turned out to be extraordinarily powerful. Oh, I'm really afraid of that. Let's turn toward it, do that thing. Oh, I'm really afraid of that. Let's turn toward it, do that thing. And every time I turned into fear in my, day-to-day living reality, it began to weaken the hold that fear had over me. And there was a natural expansion, groundedness, centeredness, and power that began to arise. So there were instances like that where it was like I was learning tools for navigating the path through my day-to-day interactions with reality, and through engagements with teachers, because I didn't study with any particular teacher. There were moments where I'd engage with a teacher where I'd receive like the next step for me along the way. So for students, for people walking, that's what I always emphasize, is like, what's your next step? What's the next thing that you need to dissolve? Where are you fixated right now that you could soften, release, let go? Because that's all you need to know. You don't have to know anything else, but what's next? What's next?
That's such a profound teaching there, because I think that for so many, because of the kind of esoteric nature of Kundalini and the practices and this sort of history of ascetics and swamis and, people who had extraordinary superpowers, I think for so many, it's this big goal, and then the day-to-day is lost in the big goal, whereas all it can possibly be really is the day-to-day, right? That living in the present moment and learning how to be more and more conscious and more of us in the present moment. So maybe you could speak a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's the key. When I talk about an everyday path of awakening, it's simply observing what's unfolding within the body, mind right now and attending to that. And so it's very easy to learn about or to think about, like you say, all of the big picture stuff and to get immersed in that. But it's like, well, hang on a minute. How are you showing up to your child in the morning when you're packing his lunch? How are you showing up to your mum when she calls? Are you noticing how you're showing up? Are you being curious about it? Are you wondering about it? And that, to me, has been probably the most powerful aspect of how I've worked this path. Like, yes, I show up to daily practice, whatever it is, but it's that observation or awareness of how I'm unfolding in the moment that leads me to then notice when there's contraction, when there's tension, when there's resistance. Because anytime that any of those things, or fear, anytime any of those things is present, then it must be coming from the mind. And if it's coming from the mind, then it must be conditioning. And if it's conditioning, then it can be attended to. Just identify, see what's needed, fully feel it, heal and release it. And so when I'm working with people, the big thing that I want to always share is not information. Like, we live in the age of information. You can get anything on the internet now. What I'm always interested in sharing is a way to perceive reality and a way to navigate reality. Because when people start to see reality in a different way, it shifts. And then when they begin to navigate reality in a different way, it shifts. So those tools for navigation, like identify when you're afraid and turn toward it, they can have amazing benefits when you show up and you work them every single day. And that's the difference between learning about stuff, being in the head, thinking about it, and simply applying it as a way to be.
Oh, that's so powerful. You are so talking my language. I love this. It's very inspiring, and it's just if everybody could be awake to this level of work and becoming alert to where the unconscious is driving them, I think we would be living in just a very different world.
Yeah. I mean, that's what motivates me. I'm like, come on, liberation in this lifetime. If I can do it, you can do it, and I'm not liberated yet, but I know I'm more liberated now than I was 15 years ago, than I was 5 years ago, than I was a year ago, and I'm probably more liberated now than I was a week ago. So there's a trajectory. And my sense is that often when people step on the path, they really separate themselves out from people like Buddha, for example, or from, masters. They think that they're separate or different from that person. It's like, nah, man, you're the same as that person. No difference between you and Buddha. He just did the work. So the question is, do you want to do the work? And do the work, which is showing up in the moment and really setting that intention of knowing it's possible for you to liberate to whatever extent, degree in this lifetime, and then doing what's necessary. Just do what's necessary. Of course, it's not that simple because the mind is very attached to being the one in charge and can come up with all kinds of reasons why it doesn't want to actually do the thing, which will lead to liberation. The mind is sneaky, 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 and it will masquerade as the apparent self. Like the spiritual identity, for example, is another way to stay stuck. And yet many people that step onto the path of yoga, etc., instead of beginning to disidentify with the contents of consciousness, they just take on a different identity, the spiritual identity. Still identified, still stuck, just looking more spiritual.
I love that. One of my teachers in India talks about that. You just gain a different language. That's all. Yeah, it's a spiritual language, but it's just another language, just another way of limiting yourself. So what are some of so we have the everyday tool that you're talking about of awareness and starting to course correct on the level of mind. What are some of the other practices that you recommend to people that they do?
Okay, so embodiment is crucial. Being able to really be embodied. So that's the beginning in many ways. And my sense is that's why yoga asana is so powerful and so necessary for most people. Because when we start, we're often in our heads and we don't even know what it feels like to be embodied. So some kind of embodiment practice, it might be dance, it could be martial arts, it doesn't necessarily be yoga asana, but embodiment practice. And then through that embodiment practice, there's a level of subtlety or awareness that begins to grow, the disidentification with the contents of consciousness as one drops down into essence nature and can both feel the body from the inside out and notice when stuff is running. So these things have to start to take place. And so when I speak of awakening, like in the tantric framework, there's 3 stages of awakening. And the first stage is beginning to disidentify with the mind and identify with essence nature, with that which we truly are. So when that happens, when there's that shift, there's an ability then to begin to unwind, to begin to dissolve, to begin to digest the samskaras and the conditioning, because you have to see it first. You have to be able to recognize, oh, that's not who I am. That's just a persona I adopted in order to feel validated, or that's just a persona I adopted in order to feel safe. Someone says to me, oh, I'm such a control freak. I'm like, well, how about you rephrase that you have a pattern of controlling? And then how about you recognize what that pattern of controlling gives you? And then how about you start to notice when that pattern of controlling is triggered? And then how about you start to experiment with what it would feel like to notice when it's triggered, but not act on it? And so there's this gradual progression towards becoming more and more aware of what's running, and then stepping more and more into choice about what you allow to run.
And so what I'm hearing there is also a reflection of like the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and what we are and how we are, and starting to change those stories.
Yeah, absolutely. It's recognizing that the image of self is a construct, and it's a construct that has been internally generated, but it's also come from external sources, like the way that we were mirrored or seen as children or as adults. And so all of that is a construct. And so when there's a recognition of that, then it's much easier to begin to notice when it's running and to notice what you can let go of, and to feel what it's like to simply be a free expression of consciousness moving through the body, which is a whole different way to be.
What makes life a lot less complicated. It's just so, we're so caught otherwise. It's all so complicated. And then we take the weight of the world on our shoulders, and we're trying to fix everything and make everything show up in a particular way. And it's just darn exhausting, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Like, I do a lot of one-on-one mentoring work with people, with students and clients, and voice messaging support is one of the things I do. And sometimes when I listen to a voice message from someone, I'm like, holy moly, that feels so exhausting, because what's going on is there's this all this strategizing around attempting to portray oneself in a particular way in order to get something, or in order to be perceived in a particular way. Or it's like, it's all of this control. It's like, whoa, what happened if you just showed up and let yourself be what you are? And of course, what comes up then usually is fear. So we're right back at being afraid. And so that's why working with fear is such a crucial aspect on the path, because once you see your shit, you have to be able to dance with fear, because otherwise fear will keep you stuck in it.
That's a great one. Fear. I know for me, something that popped its head up recently that I haven't sort of dealt with in my life much is anger. And I found out that that anger, and I guess the root of anger is fear as well. It's challenging when there's a very strong emotion like anger or fear, because it sort of sweeps the mind off with it, and it's a little harder to put the brakes on.
Yeah, absolutely. The way that I see that is that when we start to identify with essence nature, what can happen is there'll be a really strong experience that comes through. So super strong emotion like anger, and the gravitational pull of the intensity of the emotion will pull us out of essence nature and back into conditioned mind. And then we're back in reactivity. We're back in the prison as such. And then only once it's cleared and it's like got a little easier, we'll recognize where we are, and then maybe orientate back to essence nature. In time, as the resilience, as the samskaras are digested, as the energetic body gets stronger, there is more and more ability to hold super intense, super strong emotions. And so even when we get really triggered, it's possible to still stay in essence nature, to not identify with a super strong emotion. And that leads to then abiding in essence nature, which is a game changer, because then no matter how strong the emotions are, it's like, I can handle it. It can be handled. It's all okay. It's just sensation moving through the body mind. And that's such liberation. And I think it's worth pointing out that often on the spiritual path, people have a sense or an idea that it's all about getting to a place where we don't feel like shit anymore. My sense, though, is that it's not about that at all. It's about getting to a place where we don't mind how shitty we feel, because the human experience is we're always going to feel shitty. People are going to die. We're going to get injured. We're going to be sick. Like, all of these things are going to happen. And the real question is, how are we in relationship to it? Can we hold it? Can we be okay with it? Are we resilient with it? And that avoids, spiritual bypassing, trying to skip out on the humanness of being a human being.
I think that's such a valuable point. And especially in the yoga world, there's this idea of things being non-yogic, whatever that really means. And so easy to stifle oneself or make life actually harder by trying to be so perfect in some kind of confined way, I think.
that whole thing of like trying to put on another identity. If I take on the identity of yogi, then I'll have this experience. It's like it doesn't work like that. It's about disidentifying and being with what's arising. What's arising? Be with that. Be okay with that. Feel the okayness of that.
So you mentioned the sort of 3 tantric practices, and the first one is this level of mind and being able to, I think if I got this right, identify the real from the unreal. Could you share what the second 2 stages are from your perspective?
Yeah, I can. So this is the 3 stages of awakening. And so my path has been mostly experiential. Like I'm not a scholar per se. So any apologies for any errors that might be in this, but my understanding of the 3 stages of awakening according to Tantra is that the first stage is when you begin to identify with essence nature, consciousness itself, rather than the contents of consciousness. Okay. The second stage is immersion in the field of energy. So it's that unity consciousness, it's oneness. And of course, that's an experience that you can have when you're on the dance floor at an epic rave, or you can have on psychedelics, or you can have in lovemaking. So often people will have experiences of the second stage of the oneness, unity consciousness, before they have experiences of anchoring, grounding, centering down into essence nature. And I'll come back to that in a second. The third stage, final stage of awakening is, let me just feel into this. It's like becoming everything that is not. Like if you look at the second stage as becoming everything that is, the field of energy. The third stage, which I don't know if I've had that many experiential embodiments of, that one's a little more nebulous to me, but it's the sense of the unmanifest, of the field of potentiality and being immersed in that field of potentiality. And in the tantric lineages, from what I understand, when you're working with a teacher, they will emphasize systematically going through 1, 2, and 3. But in reality, what can happen, and this is what happened for me, is that I had experiences of stage 2, which was becoming the field of energy, becoming all that is, unity consciousness, before I had an experience of essence nature. And the danger of that is that one blows out completely, like becomes completely diffuse and dissolves into all that is, but there's no center, there's no grounding. And so it can just blow out, lead to psychosis, lead to all kinds of things. So being able to ground and anchor and disidentify and know yourself as essence nature is crucial. And then once those 2 things are happening, like if you can feel a sense of dropping as deep into your innerverse as possible, like going down, 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 down. And then as much as you go down into the innerverse, feel going out into feeling everything that is. And those 2 things happening at once. And those are those first 2 stages coming online as such.
That's really beautiful, the way that you describe that. And I love your term, innerverse. It makes so much sense to me. And as you're talking about your experience of that immersion in the field of like energy, that was my first experience from the perspective of Kundalini Yoga. In this case, Kundalini Yoga is taught by Yogi Bhajan. That has been a huge part of my path. And specifically because it's such a strong pranic practice that it enlivens and raises and expands your energy field so dramatically that in the little glimpses, in the moments between the dynamic exercises, there are these experiences of the totality through the experience of energy. And to me also, and I think for many students, that is the gateway into the essence nature, because if we're perceiving through the lens of the mind, it's really hard to see what's behind the mind until your energy body has shifted and stabilized at such a place that the surface mind is quietened and we have that experience. So My experience was similar to yours through Kundalini yoga, through prana being shifted and heightened and stabilized at a different frequency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it can also be complicated too if there's a lot of unresolved trauma in the system, in the energy body, in the physical body, mental, emotional body, and there's those experiences of unity consciousness, then that complicates things as well. And then if there's a lot of conditioning or if there's a tendency to disassociation, that has an impact as well. So all of these factors combine. So when people are having what's sometimes called, Kundalinī Awakening, my sense is that often what it is that second stage coming on board, and the symptoms that they experience, which can be quite uncomfortable, physical, mental, emotional, energetic symptoms, correlate or relate to the samskaras that are present, the traumas that are present, the conditioning that's present. And of course, ideally, if we were working systematically with the teacher, there would have been practices done to resolve those, to work with the traumas, to work with the samskaras, to work with the conditioning, so that when one is then immersed into unity conscious, that stuff doesn't impact and you don't end up with those really challenging symptoms that can occur. And I think that's important for people to realize, especially people that kind of get hooked on or want to go, I want to go for that amazing experience. It's like, well, be systematic about it. Look at clearing what needs to be cleared first so that your experience is much smoother, more grounded, and more easeful.
Such sage advice, because yes, we want the big high, we want that big bang, but at what cost? And that's really interesting to me, because I think there's a lot of confusion in the West about what awakening really is, and when is it psychosis, and when is it a true awakening. So I think there's confusion around that anyway in the West.
Yeah, absolutely. The experiences that I had it was everything. It was both. It was both awakening and psychosis all at the same time. And it's very difficult to pass out and go, well, that bit was the crazy and that bit was it was just all mixed in there, because the contents of my mind was so mixed in there. The unconscious was all mixed in there. So one thing when I'm working with students is that when they express a desire to experience particular states or to move into unity consciousness, etc., it's like, why? What for? Because looking at what's underlying the desire can be very interesting. And going that way, what's underlying that desire can be an important part of the awakening process. And to go into that a little bit more, if you see it like awakening is that sense of experiencing unity consciousness or identification with essence nature, right? That's that awakening. But then the liberation has to happen. And the liberation is working systematically with the contents of the mind, the samskaras, the conditioning, the traumas, to fully digest, heal, feel, release. So both of those things, awakening and liberation, need to occur. They're not the same thing. And if someone can be really awake but completely bound and still be a total asshole, for example, because they haven't done the liberation process. So someone can be starting to get quite liberated but not necessarily awake yet. So understanding where one is on the path can be useful for orientating oneself to then know, to help understand what practice is required now. What is it that I need to do right now? What is my next step based on where I am in terms of the awakening process and the liberation process?
That's so powerful. So, you just nailed it right there in terms of a practice. Is there anything else that you would love to share with the viewers here today, from your experience, from your teachings, that kind of essence of how you guide people along this path?
I think one key aspect is, the path is knowing thyself. Right. And so part of that is learning to listen to yourself, learning to trust yourself. And so realizing that there is ultimately no authority outside of you, that you are the ultimate authority. And while it's incredibly useful to work with teachers or masters, to always be discerning, skeptical, questioning, inquiring in terms of your relationship to that outside authority and to what you might be projecting onto them or to what might be occurring. And we just feel into that a little more. Yeah, it's recognizing that life will always dish you up the ideal conditions for your liberation. So when shit's gone down, one question to ask is, how does this serve my awakening? How does this serve my liberation? Because the moment that you ask that, there's a relaxation, and there can be a lessening of resistance, and then a crack opens up where you might be able to see how to shift the way you're relating to the condition, the experience, that will then lead towards or enable you to release something, let go of something, take that next step on the path. And that's gold, like just being able to do that no matter what's happening in your life is absolute gold.
So Kara-Leah, I'm just so thrilled with everything that you've shared. It feels to me like simply one of the most important conversations I've had in this entire summit because of the real world nature of it and the way that you're teaching and your understanding of the mind dominance that we all find ourselves in, like just trapped in this experience of the mind and time that is limiting us from exploring our true nature. So I really can't thank you enough for your wisdom and for your tenacity on this path of self-liberation. So thank you so much for joining us here today.
Oh, my pleasure. It's such a delight to share this with you. It is my passion, liberation this lifetime. And it's been a fucking hard road, to be blunt. It's been really painful at times. And so now my sense is if I can share tools and perspective in such a way that it lessens the suffering of other people walking this path, that just fills me with delight. So thank you for this opportunity to speak and to share with your audience. I really appreciate it.
So how can people study with you? How can they tune into what you're doing? I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who are inspired to check out more of what you're doing.
Yeah. You can find me on my website, Kara-Leah.com, no hyphen, it's Kara-Leah. And I'm on Instagram and Facebook. And I work with people. I have a program called Guru in Your Pocket, which is basically a voice messaging and one-on-one sessions where I mentor people through the process of awakening. And I lead retreats, I do trainings, and I'm in Mexico every year, usually in July or October. So the details of that are on my website. And I'm looking at coming over to the States, maybe to California next year to lead a retreat as well. So there's multiple ways to engage both online and in person. And of course, you can always come to New Zealand. It's an amazing country.
It certainly is that. Well, thank you so much again. And thank you all for being here with us today. I hope you really can take the gems that Kara-Leah has shared and know that just in this session that we've done here today, there's enough information in this session to liberate yourself. And that right there is worth the price of admission. So thank you so much, and wishing you an incredible rest of your day. And thanks again, Kara-Leah, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Kia.
Thank you for joining us for the Awaken Your Kundalini Summit, brought to you by the Shift Network. To learn more, visit awakenyourkundalini.summit.com. To join our global community of people awakening to their divine humanity and taking inspired action, visit theshiftnetwork.com. Thank you again for gathering with us and for sharing this life-enhancing path with your friends and family.